Hi, I'm Jimmy from Syracuse, New York, and you're listening to Two Broads Talking Politics.
Are you listening?
Hey everyone, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics. We're continuing with our series on climate change. I'm with my co-host Sophie. Hey Sophie.
Hey Kelly.
And joining us today is Peter Kalmus, who is a climate change scientist and is the author of Being the Change, Live Well and Spark a Climate Revolution. Hi Peter.
Hey Kelly, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. So just for some background, could you tell us a little bit about what you do and how this book came about?
Yeah, so I'm a climate scientist. I study mainly clouds. I'm getting into what's called ecological forecasting, which the way I describe it is connecting climate models to like actual living ecosystems and trying to project how they will change in the coming decades as the planet gets warmer. I've been a climate scientist since about 2012, and before that, I was an astrophysicist searching for gravitational waves. But I was getting more and more concerned about climate change and reading the science more and reading papers more, and basically getting incredibly distracted by climate breakdown and what I see as, and there's a lot of scientific sort of evidence backing this, what I see as the greatest threat facing humanity right now. So it felt a little weird to be thinking about supernova and neutron stars on the other side of the galaxy when there's a lot of stuff to be done here and to understand and to kind of try to get people to act on climate change. And so I switched fields. And the reason the book came about was because, you know, I've been super concerned since 2006. So that was when I was getting my PhD in physics in New York. And, you know, I kept thinking, what can I do? Because it's so overwhelming and it's a global problem. And there's almost 8 billion of us now. And so it's this question, you know, like, how can I, like, you know, obviously I can't fix it myself, but what can I do with what I have to have the biggest possible effect and to address the problem as skillfully as possible? And this was like around 2010. I was looking around for other people who were answering that question, and I wasn't finding a whole lot of stuff that was satisfying. And I was also exploring using less fossil fuel myself because it's sort of an obvious thing to do. I'm like, I see the harm that burning this stuff causes. It really does cause harm. I made that connection. And I'm like, well, then it would be really weird if I'm so concerned about this, if I didn't try to start burning less. And naturally, you know, I wanted to burn less. I just don't want to cause that harm. And so that kind of became like a core action for me. And I started to realize that when I gave talks to the public, people in my community, talks that were arranged by like Transition or Citizens Climate Lobby, people really responded well to the fact that I was actually making these changes. They were really curious about it. And so I realized that I had a more powerful voice and a more authentic voice when I was actually examining this part of my life and making these changes and sort of walk. And that kind of turned into the book, because the other surprising thing I found was it wasn't making me less happy. It really didn't feel like a sacrifice. I mean, it was different, the changes I was making. But, you know, the prevailing message was that, you know, life's going to suck without fossil fuel. And I was like, actually, in a lot of ways, life's better with fossil fuels. And so that led to the book, because I wasn't seeing that message getting out.
Mm-hmm. So many people, you know, say things like, well, individual actions don't matter as much as, you know, what government does, what business does. So why did you decide to focus on individual actions?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And as I've been walking on this, it's become more and more clear that those two categories are sort of non-existent. It's an illusion that there's a separation between what we call individual change and what we call collective change. There's no sharp distinction. So I think most people assume that the reason someone like me, or the reason I reduce my emissions, is to keep the CO2 out of the atmosphere. That's not actually why I do it at all. Because if that was why I was doing it, it'd be totally depressing. Because like I said, there's almost 8 billion people, and that's too small of a change, and we need to get to net zero super fast. You know, certainly by mid-century, if not sooner the better. And so that would be pretty depressing if that was my main motivation. But the main reason I do it is to kind of send a message of urgency to wake people up and to shift the culture. And so, think about a protest movement, okay? Something like Sunrise or Extinction Rebellion or the school strikes. Every single individual who goes on one of those protests or strikes is making a courageous decision because they're speaking truth to power. There's cops there. They could get arrested. They don't know how the people, the onlookers, are going to react. They might get people jeering at them or challenging them. So it's a courageous decision on an individual level, and yet it turns into a collective movement, right? And so that's exactly the way I see burning less fossil fuel, especially if you can find out what brings you happiness in doing that and sort of like share that with people, share it with a smile and do it conspicuously and write about it or sing about it or talk to people about it as much as you can. That's the reason I do it, is to try to, there's too many climate leaders, I think, who are saying we have to stop burning fossil fuel, and their carbon footprints are even bigger than the average person. And so I think that their actions are sending the inverse message, and people are really sensitive to that. They can see that, if this person is telling us to change and they are not even changing themselves, either it's not that urgent and who knows why they're saying that, or else maybe it's too hard, which is demoralizing. And so would kind of not inspire them to change, right?
So what are some of the specific things that you did do to reduce your carbon footprint? Could you tell us a little bit about maybe a couple of the things that you found the most satisfying or had the biggest impact?
Right. Well, the thing that had the biggest impact by far for me was to fly less. And over the course of 3 years, I actually went from flying around 50,000 miles a year, which is pretty typical for an academic. A lot of academics, scientists, and other academics fly even more than that. And so I haven't flown since 2012 just because it doesn't feel good for me to be on a plane. The last time I was sitting on a plane, I was sort of like, I don't belong here. It was already taking off. I'm like, I want to get off of this, but I had to, I was already on a plane. So, if there was something that I thought was going to be very, if I could take a flight that would have like a huge impact on climate awareness, for example, or kind of maybe getting policymakers to act, I might consider doing it, but it's hard for me to imagine anything convincing me at this point to be a good enough reason to make me overcome the feeling of not wanting to be on a plane. So anyway, that the flying was like 3/4 of one footprint. And I like to emphasize that this is going to be different for everyone. What one person's biggest action will depend on what they're burning and how they're burning it. I also stopped eating meat, which was my second biggest, most impactful change. And I think that was pretty easy for me. Flying was more challenging. I had to change expectations of family members and kind of expectations at work. So we do a lot of long road trips and long train rides, because we have family in Chicago. So Los Angeles to Chicago, that's about 2,000 miles. But we enjoy the train too, actually. And we actually enjoy car trips because I get to camp along the way in Utah and some of the national parks there. So that's kind of great. And then some smaller changes, biking more. Biking wasn't as big for me since, I compared to the flying, just people don't understand how much fuel those planes burn. But the good thing about biking was, for me, it's like 100% joyful act, and it keeps me healthy, just like, being vegetarian also helps me stay healthy. So that one's very easy to sustain. And all the changes I made, I would keep doing, even if there was no warming, except I'd probably fly occasionally, but not as much as I used to, because it was exhausting. And, I prefer sort of slowing down and staying in my community a little bit. And you can get more involved in your community if you're not always on the other side of the world. But, it is pretty amazing to be able to get someplace, that's thousands of miles away in a matter of hours. That's amazing. I think it's a shame that we take it for granted so much, and we even complain about it, right? People get on planes and, they complain about all this stuff when it's really kind of a miracle that they can even do that.
So I think one of the things that people push back on sometimes when they think about this stuff is they feel like it's an all or nothing. Like you have to cut your own carbon footprint down to zero or why bother? So how would you respond to that sort of stuff? You know, what would be your advice for people who think about, well, I can't cut out flying altogether, but, you know, I'm interested in doing what I can do?
That's a great question. So I think that someone who had that attitude would definitely be thinking that the reason for doing it is to keep their emissions out of the atmosphere. And I would say shift to thinking about changing the culture. We know that fossil fuel is starting to kill people, and it's having this hugely damaging effect on the biosphere. And the projections are not good, as you know. So we know this stuff is bad, right? We got to shift the culture away from it. We got to imagine a society that doesn't have fossil fuel at all. And so, you know, anything that you can do, especially if you can do it conspicuously and talk to people about it, and like I said, find what makes you happy about it, that is going to shift the culture. And, you know, keep in mind that flying less is better than flying. Trying to talk to colleagues and friends and family about the impacts of flying, because I think too few people know just how bad it is. There's a lot of, you know, the zero waste movement, plastic waste and other landfill waste is very immediate. It's very easy to see. It's very tangible. Carbon dioxide waste is what's really killing things right now, and it's invisible. It's harder to see. People don't actually usually lift jugs of fossil fuel. It goes into their cars, into the airplane. They don't see it. They don't sense it. They don't see it coming out of the tailpipe. So that's a much bigger problem. We have to raise awareness on that. And, you know, it's not that immediate. And I think, you know, some of the zero wasters actually fly a lot. And that just, to me, says that it's a good place to raise awareness. Because as awareness gets raised, I think that can shift to other parts of the fossil fuel culture.
How do you do things conspicuously in raising awareness without, you know, turning people off or or making them be like, oh, you're just that freak over there who does that stuff?
I'll probably get a lot of you know, vegans mad at me for saying this, but there are a lot of vegans are very militant, you know, on places like Twitter, and it can be sort of a turn for people. I'm not sure it's the most skillful means. They're absolutely right that it's better for the planet to have a vegan diet, for sure. But the question is, how do we skillfully kind of transmit that lifestyle to other people? It's a very, very hard question. I think the best way to do it is actually one person at a time, and by doing it by example, but sort of like quietly setting the example, you know, not clobbering people over the head with it at every opportunity, but just like saying, you know, what's great about being vegan, for example, or what's great about living with less fossil fuel, not trying to guilt people into using less, but sort of highlighting the things that are good, because it's a very healthy lifestyle, right? We know that humans are happier when they're more integrated into community, and we know they're healthier when they eat less animal products. And so, you know, the kind of vegan low fossil fuel lifestyle where you are, like, low fossil fuel means being slower, moving slower, you know, gardening more, for example, if you're into gardening, going to city council meetings and talking about, you know, electricity policies in your community, getting involved at kind of the local level with politics, maybe organizing things at a more national level. This is all community, right? And, you know, it's an essential part of being happy. And especially if you're concerned about climate change right now and you possibly have some climate anxiety, the antidote to that is getting really active and to feeling like you're doing everything you can do. And you know, this can work well one-on-one in conversations, making, you know, maybe having talking to people over coffee about climate change, starting a group in your community, and using your own skills and your own networks and your own interests to spread the message. You know, if you like writing, if you like music, you know, if you're a musician, if you make films, if you're an artist of some kind, or even if you're like, you know, maybe a lawyer, for example, you can start getting involved with kind of climate law. So the answer is highly personal because we all have different skills. So the most skillful means is going to be different for everyone.
There have been a couple of jurisdictions that have been implementing policies to sort of encourage people to do the good thing or discourage them from doing the bad thing, right? There are is it Colorado, I think, in Boulder, Colorado, where they just passed a few years ago a municipal carbon tax. Carbon taxes are kind of like a thing now in the United States. There's a couple of jurisdictions that have worked to prohibit people from having plastic bags and all sorts of things. So do you think there's a place for government regulation in encouraging people to decrease their carbon footprint?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly why I do what I do. What people would call maybe kind of individual scale stuff. I do it precisely to get policies, especially at the national, and that could maybe even translate into international cooperation. That's exactly why I do what I do. We can't have a strong policy that's really going to start ramping down carbon emissions until the people demand that, right? So it's been moving. In 2018, we made so much progress in terms of raising awareness. Among Democrats, I think climate change went from near the bottom of the list of issues. If you put the 12 issues that people usually vote on, gun control, the economy, healthcare, immigration, all that stuff. Climate change was near the bottom, even among Democrats. And now it's moved up to, something like number 4, and it's still moving up through the ranks. Until it gets near the top, people aren't really going to be voting on climate, but most people are going to be voting on something else. And the politicians know that. And even if there was a politician who was super eager to enact some kind of climate policy, they're not going to be able to do it if they know their most skillful means might not be to enact that policy if they just get voted out and then they lose their platform, right? So we in a democracy, we need the masses to demand climate action. And so it's coming from the grassroots. How do we convey that urgency to people? Well, I think especially if climate activists and leaders are starting to burn less themselves, that greatly increases their authenticity, and that will spread. There's so much momentum right now. There's so much happening at the grassroots, and there's a real social shift happening right now, maybe even a tipping point. And I predict that it's not going to go away because it's being driven by climate disaster. And unfortunately, climate disaster is basic physics, and it's not going away. So I think these movements are just going to get stronger and stronger. We have to keep pushing and doing everything we can at every level. And that includes burning less ourselves and getting involved at the community level. I just want to comment really quick. You mentioned a carbon tax. This is going to maybe seem a little wonky, but I just want everyone to think a little bit about the difference between a carbon tax and a carbon fee. Because that often gets kind of swept under the rug, and that distinction isn't made enough, I think. A carbon tax is when the government, makes CO2 emissions more expensive, puts a price on CO2 emissions, makes the fossil fuel more expensive, but then keeps that money that's generated and then uses it for whatever. All right, so that's going to make low-income households, their share that they're spending on energy is going to go up. It's not going to be very popular, as we've seen in France with the Yellow Jackets. A carbon fee, on the other hand, instead of the government keeping the money, they give it all back to the people. So, for example, in a monthly dividend check, if you got a check back in the mail every month from some policy, and it was a pretty decent-sized check, that's going to be a popular policy. And the other thing is it's going to be progressive. It's not going to be regressive because rich people use more fossil fuel, so they're going to be contributing, they're going to be paying more in, right, because they're burning so much more. They're taking more plane trips, they got bigger houses, et cetera. And it gets divided up equally. So that means lower and middle income houses actually come out ahead. All right. So that's why it's progressive. And I think the left especially really needs to realize this. Not all carbon pricing schemes are the same at all. I'm really against cap and trade, and I'm actually against a carbon tax. I don't think that, I think giving the money back to the people is actually not optional. I don't think the policy would work unless you did that. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
I also should point out that I think that a policy like that works better at the national level than at like a local or state level, just because, you got this border issue where if you're making the energy more expensive in some jurisdiction, you have to have some adjustment so that businesses and industries just don't move out and pollute somewhere else. And it's hard to do those kinds of border adjustments at a state or local level.
One thing you talk about some in your book is meditation and connecting this to sort of your own spiritual practice. And I've noticed something similar. I've been a vegetarian for like 15 years now, but I recently realized I wasn't really thinking that much about what I ate anymore, which was sort of part of the point of becoming a vegetarian. So I've been trying to move toward a vegan, not 100% vegan, but more vegan. And I found that that's something that the really appealing part to me is now I have to think again about everything I put in my mouth, about every choice I'm making. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about sort of that aspect of it for you.
Yeah, well, it's a little controversial. Some people don't like the idea of kind of meditation being sort of an action that has anything to do with climate action. For me, it's really important. I think everyone's going to be different here. It's interesting to point out a parallel with a friend of mine, another climate scientist named Catherine Hayhoe. She's Christian, and I think she's, her practice of Christianity actually has some parallels to my meditative practice. I don't kind of affiliate with any organized religion, but I think for both of us, it allows us to also, and this has been really helpful for me, to detach from in a healthy way to detach from the kind of intensely, the intense kind of horrific, depressing side of kind of holding this knowledge of climate breakdown. Yeah, I've experienced depression in the past, and I will tell you, I can't do anything when I'm depressed. I can't act. I can't inspire anyone else. So it's really important for me to be able to kind of hold this knowledge and still be happy at some level. And there's a real parallel here to just being mortal, to knowing that we're all going to die someday, and to not let that pull us down into depression. To keep acting, to still be able to enjoy life, savor life, connect with people, have healthy relationships, even with this looming over our head. And, somehow that's meditation is what works for me. There's so many different practices that will work for different people, I think. But for me, kind of the two things that help me, I think, stay sane through all of this are doing everything I can. So trying to act and constantly reassess what I'm doing, both in terms of how I relate to fossil fuels and other energy sources, but also how I relate to kind of direct action and grassroots action and getting politically engaged. So doing what I can is a big part of how I stay sane, but also meditating, which is a practice which is designed to kind of to find an inner joy that doesn't come from external vicissitudes, which can be a good thing happening or a bad thing happening. But either way, it's largely out of our control what happens outside of us. So if there's some way to find something deeper and be happy even when that happens, and when a good thing happens, to say, well, a good thing happened, that's great, and let's see how long it lasts, right, until the fortunes change, and sort of when they do change, kind of experience that with a smile. To me, that's been a very helpful practice.
Is there anything else that you'd like to make sure we talk about?
I don't know. I want people to really start to realize how urgent this is and how little time there is left, and to start making it a priority and envisioning a world without fossil fuel, and maybe even envisioning what a world would be like where humanity was living in harmony with the biosphere. A completely different way of living than we have now, where, our culture is to conquer nature and to sort of separate us from nature and to try to kind of pretend that we're immortal in some way through our technology. Iron Man is kind of the superhero. Iron Man is sort of an image of that. But what's the superhero that kind of, is aligned with nature and is okay with the fact that we're just one species in this web, this beautiful web, and isn't trying to leave the Earth, but instead is just so happy to be here and kind of filled with awe that we get to walk for some time on this beautiful planet. And, how can we spread that awareness, and how can we act in the short term to go away from fossil fuel, and where are we going as a species, in the longer term? Say we take care of this immediate problem, how can we explore technology with more wisdom, and how can we sort of respect the rest of the life on the planet as equals to us?
All right. Well, Peter, thank you so much for joining us, and people should check out your book, which is a really fun read. We'll put a link to that up on our website. And I hope everyone will start thinking about, just pick one thing this week, this month that you can work on and start to move toward using less fossil fuel.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for the discussion. It was fun.
Thanks for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant-Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Westland and was created for use by this podcast.